We're honored to have Kate Raymer from Redaptive, Marie Thompson from Powerhouse Ventures, Rebecca Hu from Glacier, and Sanjna Mapani, did I pronounce correctly, from WaveGrid join us tonight on a discussion around digital transformation for sustainability and decarbonization. The panel will be about half an hour long, and then we'll have around 15 minutes for Q&A. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Yan. I'm an investment analyst at TDK Ventures, focusing on energy and climate tech investment. I feel when we talk about climate tech, the first impression that people have are always hardware solutions. So today I'd like to take a little time talking about digital innovations and think about how much digital solutions or software solutions can help move the needle for decarbonization and sustainability. So maybe I'll direct this question to you, Kate, and Rebecca, since both of you are working on solutions that have both hardware and software components to it. Maybe tell us, how those two pieces fit together in your technologies, and how much do you think the software component can help with decarbonization and sustainability?
Yeah, and I'm happy to start if you'd like. So Redaptive is a company that provides energy efficiency and solar solutions to provide sustainability to Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 customers. Part of that is that we build our own meter to investigate circuit level consumption. So we're validating lighting upgrades at the panel at the circuit level. So there's a hardware component built right into our solution, and we had to kind of create our own meters. We couldn't get something that was granular enough that was on the market at a reasonable price. I am a longtime clean tech person, so a lot of my previous life has always had a hardware component, whether it's batteries or solar inverters or meters. There's always something there physically in the world. And if we're trying to impact something as large as climate change, then yeah, it kind of makes sense that there's going to be something physically there in the world to help support that. One really kind of interesting sort of mostly digital project or sort of purely digital project that I would highlight here is that we're interested in leveraging our meter data to provide more suggestions for climate change to our customers. So not to climate change, for sustainability to our customers. So for example, we can actually detect if a customer is using non-LED lighting on their circuits based on the profile from our meter data. It's pretty cool. And we would like to get to a place where we're able to do all of that without an extra audit. So usually in an energy efficiency process, you send someone out to the site, you're physically taking inventory of all of the equipment in the building. And so we would like to get to a place where that's a more and more digitized solution, especially where we already have meters installed. Can't do it yet with utility meter data per se, but with our meter we can. So that's kind of an example where the training data is going to be based on real information, hardware from the real world, but we're going to make a more and more digitized solution to make this a more efficient process. So.
Yeah, I can go next. I'm Rebecca. I'm the co-founder of Glacier, and we are building AI-enabled automation for recycling facilities and manufacturers. So when we first started Glacier, it was because we saw a very clear market need for a hardware product to help these facilities sort, right? To give you some context, if you walk into a recycling facility, even today, the vast majority of the sorting of the stuff in your recycling bin is still done by hand. And that's necessary because these facilities make their bread and butter on selling giant bales of paper, plastic, aluminum, all of these commodities to end users to turn into new stuff. So we started out by building this robot, and we're using computer vision and AI to basically scan the line and then tell the robot what to pick and where to sort it. So that was step one. We always knew that the data set we were going to be collecting at scale about what's coming through the recycling stream and the waste stream would be hugely valuable to literally everyone in the circular economy. So not only recyclers, but brands, manufacturers, governments, et cetera. But what was really interesting to us was, to Kate's point, we were like, okay, there's got to be some hardware component. There's actually been a really, really unexpectedly strong market pull for even just that software data that we're collecting at this point. So I was telling Marie right before this, we're working with one of our first customers, which is a recycling facility down in Monterey that's using just our AI. And when I approached the owner of the facility, he was like, oh my God, this is the thing I've been looking for. We've been trying to do this ourselves. And I was like, how do you do this yourself? And he was like, we mount a GoPro over the conveyor belt. And I literally hired a guy to sit there, and his full-time job is just to watch the live stream and count how many items are going by, right? Like that's how it's currently being done. So even the fact that we can use computer vision to just automate that job for them and help them quantify what's coming through, what are we losing, how do we improve our operations, is already an order of magnitude more efficient than what they are currently doing. So we are seeing a lot of power in even just that software layer that we're building.
That's crazy to hear. Like someone would just sit there with like a GoPro.
Yes.
Great. So Sanjna, I know WithGrid is a pure SaaS product as well. So how does your solution work, and how do you see your solution help with decarbonization?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Sanjna Malpani. I am Chief of Staff at WeaveGrid. So WeaveGrid sits at the intersection of two behemoth industries, that is the energy industry and the transportation industry. And this is obviously a really exciting time because so many vehicles are going electric, right? That S-curve of electrification and vehicle growth, it's never been more exciting. But it's also terrifying for utilities because the truth is that the grid was never actually built for vehicles. And so now they're in this really interesting position, which is, oh my God, this is a huge opportunity because they get to make more money by selling more electricity. But at the same time, it's a huge cost to them to also have to be able to suddenly now like build out all this infrastructure for vehicles. And by infrastructure, I'm not just talking about like additional chargers. So for a utility, sort of the biggest sort of blind spot for them on their system ends up being at the distribution level. And that's also where the most costs come in when you're just, when you have that many EVs coming online. So, again, both of these industries now having to work together that have never interacted before. And so WeaveGrid is an ecosystem enabler there. And our CEO, Apoorv, likes to joke that the last time the two industries worked together was when Thomas Edison and Henry Ford went camping in the 1920s. So we built a software layer that is essentially for utilities to help them plan and essentially give them visibility into all the EVs so they can make the most out of them. Again, from a planning perspective, but also as future grid assets. And so, a big way that we do this is, again, by keeping all the stakeholders, so the utility industry, the auto OEMs, and then obviously the final end customer, the driver, in mind, and always optimizing around that. And so, again, that's around 3,000 utilities out there in this country, at least 20 plus OEMs, and we're that systems orchestrator that's sitting in between and making sure that they're all talking to each other and that things are going smoothly, again, for the end customer.
Got it. So I'm thinking for a sustainability perspective, is it that WithGrid can help utility to utilize the power that usually can get curtailed, and that way they can be used for charging?
So there's layer one, right, which is, okay, when is charging happening, and is it happening at times that the grid is already stressed? So one, we manage that for them. The second piece is, okay, if you're just shifting the charging though, aren't you just creating another artificial peak, which is true. So we're doing it at a very, very, very hyper-local level and sort of in a way that's optimized for the distribution system as a systems orchestrator. So I think a future sort of roadmap would be, okay, let's also think about how we're better using the vehicles as assets after, their first and foremost need is met as a mobility resource. And to answer the second part of your first question, though, it's how does this drive decarbonization? So again, the utility industry, so the energy industry and the transportation industries, they're 60 to 62% of all, carbon emissions worldwide, and especially here in the US. So just tackling that industry, making any kind of inroads into either one has a huge impact.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And Marie, I know that digital innovation is near and dear to Powerhouse Ventures, given you're one of the few climate-oriented VC that focus very much on digital or software solutions. I'm curious, what prompted your team to focus, only on digital solutions to start off?
Yeah, I think there's a few reasons that we play in the kind of fully digital space for the most part. The first is that there's no world in which we hit our decarbonization goals without the role of software and digital solutions. So one, just like acknowledging alongside infrastructure and project finance and alongside hardware and deep tech innovation, software needs and will play a role. So we saw an opportunity there and kind of an impact orientation there. I think the second piece is that there was a gap. We launched Fund 1 back in 2018, and kind of looking around, we have an old 2x2 that is now a lot more crowded, but still the trend is still there. We're really early stage, which is what we do, and digital innovation isn't as well served. I think the third reason is just software is often more scalable and fits a little bit better into a kind of vanilla VC framework, which is a 10-year fund life. And so we're just structurally set up, I think, a little bit better. And the last one is just on the team side. I think to really do hard tech or project finance, you need really specialized teams that really know what they're doing and can take tech risk and early commercialization risk on the finance side. And we are not that team. So the fourth reason was just knowing ourselves and pulling all of those pieces together.
Okay, great. And what metrics do you usually use to evaluate digital solution that come your way?
In terms of impact?
Impact, and given like your investor, maybe like their potential financial performance in the future.
Yeah, I could spiel for way too long about what we look for in our diligence process, so I can keep it really short. I mean, we're looking at often the same buckets that other investors are looking at. We're looking for exceptional teams, we're looking for products that have pain points, we're looking for customers that are willing to pay, business models that can monetize and scale over time, go-to-market strategies that are well-informed. So I think a lot of the things we look at are the same. We're still looking at unit economics, but maybe in a different world and for margins that look maybe a bit different from the hard tech side, but a lot of it is similar. I think our biggest piece is that we're not taking on tech risks or really commercialization R&D risks. So we're kind of just skipping past a very delicate stage where software can often be iterated on and adapting just a lot faster just because it is easier to code. So we can kind of skip some of the more sensitive stages in the beginning, and so then therefore expect scale to look a little bit different than maybe some hardware companies.
Right. Okay, great. So now I'm going to shift gear a little bit to talk about the scalability for digital innovations. We know for hardware solutions, we've seen there are constraints to some of the solutions, like especially around battery or semiconductor supply chains. There are constraints on where they can develop or deploy then technologies. Do you see any kind of similar scalability challenges for software solutions, whether it's because of culture difference or different regulation landscapes or different market structures? And this is a question open to the group.
I have two answers that I can kind of pull out of my pocket quickly based on life experience. One is that Sanjna said this a minute ago. There are 3,000 electric utilities in the US. That's bananas.
Half of them are like local municipalities, basically, that own their own infrastructure. But if you're trying to do a nationwide program where you're trying to communicate with all of those utilities or integrate with those different programs, even to understand what the rates are in all of those different areas, it's really, really hard to scale. So there's a variety of different digital solutions that try to aggregate that information. A different lens on this answer is about BMS systems. So in this building, right, there's a variety of control systems. And this building probably has pretty modern control systems, but not every building does. And so ironically, one of the best ways to scale in the older buildings is by installing a piece of hardware and then leveraging that piece of hardware to connect up to the cloud, because a lot of the older systems are not connected to the cloud in any way, shape, or form. So there are some solutions out there to scalability challenges, but when I think about the things that I want to work on with my team, I don't want to integrate with a whole bunch of really old BMS systems. And we're going to need to be able to control our HVAC equipment to be able to effectively affect the building consumption in any way, shape, or form, or to guarantee savings for our customers. So those are some of the things that worry me on a day-to-day basis.
And I know that Redaptive work with clients across the globe. Do you find yourself have to deploy very different solutions for clients in those different regions?
Yeah, I mean, even making sure we have metering solutions for specific countries in the world is like an entire project, because there's different regulations, electrical codes, standards, et cetera, at different countries. So We have not actually fully solved that problem, but we're working on it.
Yeah, I can kind of echo what Kate was saying as well within the recycling and the circular economy space. There are a couple of interesting kind of software or digital scaling challenges that we foresee and we're really excited to tackle. One is a very similar analog to I think what you were saying, which is just the waste and the recycling infrastructure across this country is extremely patchwork, right? Similarly, it's like, I mean, you all have had the experience, like I have a peanut butter jar, does this get recycled or not? And the answer is it really literally depends on like what county you live in or what facility it's going to, right? Because there is no one unified system dictating what can or can't be recycled. And so certainly it is a challenge trying to create an actual circular economy that takes into account, very localized legislation, localized end markets for the feedstock that we're sorting, as well as all different kinds of players, government, brands, recyclers, haulers, you name it. So that's more on, I guess, like the business or the network effect side of things, but certainly as you're thinking about how to build out that software layer for the products that we're making, you have to take that level of variability into account. And the second one is, in order for our AI to really deliver its full value, it really needs to be thoughtful about its taxonomy. And specifically what I mean by that is, what is the layer at which you are identifying the stuff that's coming through the material stream, right? Manufacturers care about, for example, the plastic resin that is in a container because that's what they ultimately need to extrude to turn into a new plastic resin. Consumers certainly are not going to be like, oh, this is made out of polypropylene and this other thing is made out of PET, and therefore, let me recycle one and not the other. Like, that's not how we think about things. I was literally on a call today with one of the directors of packaging sustainability at a Fortune 200 consumer company, and they were talking about the challenges around, can we get AI to do things like identifying, chapsticks, little floss packets, just like this whole laundry list of things. And as we all know as consumers, that laundry list is not static, right? It's ever evolving every single day. So how do you train AI that can actually handle the challenge of literally infinite different packaging formats, right? So that's also a huge scaling challenge that we're encountering, but we're really excited to take a crack at it.
Yeah. I know you have experience working in like Asian Pacific market. Maybe you can comment on what you've seen different in that market versus in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just building off of that, it's funny, I'm from India, and every time I go back and I'm like, wait, I need to recycle these things. Like, I need to keep this completely separate. And it's funny because actually recycling there is way, like happens more informally, but happens at a much better scale because, again, you have, various people whose livelihoods just depend on it. But yeah, I was just thinking of that as you were mentioning, different places have such different sort of regulations, or forget regulations, but even cultural ways that they approach waste and things like that. But my experience actually working both in Asia Pacific and East Africa, so I spent some time working there specifically on smart metering. And my experience working there has actually been it's been very interesting because I firmly believe that in this space, so in like the climate and sustainability space, you can't do software without hardware. But I'm learning more and more that you can't do hardware without software either. And so the company I was working for in Kenya, we did a very, very low-cost smart metering device that was essentially for like off-grid utilities. So again, it was obviously a physical product. We faced a lot of issues with like customs, getting it across borders. Sometimes apparently once had like pirates hijack some ship that the meters were on. It was like a whole thing. So obviously we faced all of those challenges, right, of like working in different geographies and etc. But a huge bonus was that because we were using software to help optimize so much of that, the value that also provided in terms of just, giving the utilities insight into what that usage was, or just ensuring that they were suddenly being more efficient with all their assets. Like, I think that delivered so much value that eventually, people were like, oh, you'll never get these like off-grid utilities to pay for your product. And we actually ended up finding the opposite. Like, there was too much demand. We couldn't end up shipping all the meters that we needed quickly enough. So, I think, again, like, the whole time I was there, every time I go back to India, I literally never have to pull out any cash, because one thing that's really taken off is like mobile money, right? In like all of these places. And so again, suddenly every single person has a super powerful computer in their pocket. And so when you're talking about like digital transformations in literally any industry, I think things are really, really shifting. And even when it relates to like sustainability, people are making much smarter purchase decisions and have more information than ever to like, make those decisions. So.
And if some entrepreneur come to you and say, "Oh, I want to expand to Asian Pacific market or African market," what suggestion would you give them?
The number one suggestion that I would give them is go and like spend some time there and like fully understand that market. I think people know this, but don't always do that. And so even with the company that I was at, it was interesting because we had our whole like commercial team sitting in East Africa and Asia Pacific, but we didn't have a single engineer who was actually building the product. They were all sitting in the US. And so, again, you would think obviously this communication can happen easily or, people will figure it out. That's what your product manager is for, etc. But every time they went out to field or every time they visited, again, in like Myanmar or visited Kenya, etc., they were like, we're building the wrong thing. Oh my God, we need to like redo everything we're doing. So I think it's just like, yes, it's amazing people want to expand and build products, especially for developing countries. But I think having that like nuance and understanding before you just go out and say, hey, I'm going to solve all your problems, decarbonization. It's like, okay, understand is that what the problem actually is.
Got it. And then the challenge, does it usually come from like the hardware integration, or is like customer behave differently in those different regions?
I think there's a lot of that too. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but in my experience, there definitely has been a lot of that too. Again, we saw at Spark Meter that in West Africa, depending on like where you hung the meters, people were using some of that as like clotheslines, just because they've been used to, climbing certain types of trees to get to, because dust travels up and they don't want their clothes to get dusty, etc. Versus in East Africa, hanging it, at a certain level was like perfectly fine and nothing would happen. In like certain other parts, I think maybe just outside of Myanmar, we found that again at a certain like level or a certain type of tree, there was a monkey that it's a breed of monkeys that were exceptionally smart that like tried to crack these meters open. They're just like very interesting sort of, I don't even know if it's cultural, but just very country specific nuances that, especially if you're deploying hardware solutions and especially if they are more distributed, they're just additional considerations.
Yeah, very interesting. And Marie, do you have anything to add on the?
I think it's been covered. It's a really fragmented regulatory environment, and a utility in the UK behaves a lot differently than a utility in the US. And if you're a company trying to sell products in both markets, it requires a hugely thoughtful architecting and sales process, and it's nothing is like a copy paste situation. I think with a lot of like the legacy stakeholders that we work with, and so long sales cycles, a lot of more slow moving incumbents, less familiarity with digitization to begin with. A lot of those issues can make things a little bit slower.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I want to ask everyone, what are some digital innovation you're most excited about recently? Doesn't have to be something you directly work on. I know you probably want to name the one that you work on.
I can give a couple. So I've been in the clean tech space a really long time. So I think maybe that's part of where my recommendations come from. One of them is Utility API, which was a powerhouse company.
Accelerator company.
An accelerator company, excuse me. And that is sort of an aggregator of utility meter data. They don't have all the utilities in the US, but they have like a huge portion of the whole US population. Another one that's really small but really interesting if you go look at some of the maps and information on their public-facing website is WattTime. They aggregate ISO information about how clean the grid is in a given region, and you can pull up a map and literally see like it's dirty in Wyoming and clean in California. It's pretty cool. It's a California-centric view of the world, sorry. So those are two of mine.
Yeah, I had a few, but that's probably not surprising, so I'll try to keep it short. I think one is just like enabling automation with digital solutions, again, kind of leaning into this idea that hardware and software can't be separated. So we have a company called Terabase Energy. They're doing utility scale solar automation, and they're really sitting in between EPCs and developers on the like assembly of and like management and construction of utility scale solar plants. And if we're going to deploy solar at the rates that we really need to, you can't have humans in the field kind of clunking around with things. And I think what's most exciting about this is it's really fully enabled by the digital pieces of this, and the unlocks are really exciting. So they had a plant opening last week. We were there. One of their customers was on this panel, and the guy from First Solar was talking about they design modules to be assembled and packaged and shipped with humans in the loop. And so if you can design robots and automation and different settings where you can get humans out of the loop, it can really transform the way we are even manufacturing solar panels, how they're coming together, how we're financing them, like a lot of really interesting pieces. And so yes, the robots are doing like the literal heavy lifting, but all of the tagging and optimizing and data behind it really allows for those types of insights that can drive like innovation. And utility scale solar has to be one of kind of the big pillars that we use for decarbonization. Another example that sounds really squishy, but honestly, we're seeing this all the time, is really, really bad customer experiences that can be solved by software that can't be solved by hardware alone. And so two I'll give is just one, in the EV charging experience. If you don't drive a Tesla, it's pretty bad. And there's some hardware pieces, there's some firmware pieces, there's charger help that's doing the technician side, but we're invested in a company called AmpUp, and that kind of digital layer that is suited for a human who's delighted to interact with it. Like, we are now moving out of the early adopter nerd phase and into the mass adoption, and those people need great customer experiences to be interested, excited, to use and use products like that. Another example on the customer experience side is home electrification. We all know buildings are a big part of our carbon footprint, and the average consumer, it's expensive, it's confusing, and so if you can have really great tools to help educate and lead people through and help manage the contractor process, which everybody hates, you can help really unlock an industry. So we're investing in a company called Helio that does that as well. And the last thing I'll say is kind of along this line on like, a lot of us work in really fragmented industries, so this idea of serving the long tail or this expanding newer set of customers that are coming in or intersecting with climate in a new way. We have a few companies that kind of play in this space, like a company called Taiba that's doing optimization for front-of-the-meter battery storage. As you have a increasing number of people who are owning and operating those assets, not all of them are power users that can hire an Excel whiz to do it all, which doesn't even work for most of these markets anyway. If you're just an owner and you need to auto bid and you want to do it really well and make a lot of money, like that's a place where software can really help bring in the long tail, give them the tools they need to succeed. So lots of examples, but those are three buckets that I'm especially excited about.
I guess we're going in sequence. All right, I'll give you two really quick ones. One is directly related to recycling, which is basically new, innovative, advanced chemical recycling techniques. Glacier doesn't really play in that downstream category, but for those of you who aren't aware, recycling for certain commodities is great, like aluminum, because you can literally just melt it down and reuse it over and over and over again into infinity. For other things like plastics, it's a lot more troubling because you can only recycle it 3 to 7 times before the polymers become basically too short to be reused again. So there are a lot of companies out there that are trying to find ways to unlock at the chemical level, how could you use PET into infinity? And once you can do that, then you achieve this like insane transformation of the commodities that we already have on the marketplace, right? The second one is more in advances in computer vision. Obviously, Glacier is very interested in those types of advances, but things like the segment anything model that came out recently, really we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like we're a seed stage company, we don't have infinite resources, but because there's so much open source information out there, that's accelerating our own development, and it's allowing us to kind of achieve much bigger impact than we would have been able to even a decade ago as a 20-person company. I'm
actually gonna go with something that's in circular economy as well. So, we all know that fast fashion contributes to 10% of global emissions. That's actually more than like maritime and aviation together. And so I'm actually very, very excited about, this whole new trend that's popping up, just, even apart from slow fashion and focusing on like smaller, like capsule wardrobes and whatnot, but there are all these platforms now, that software platforms that also allow you to like purchase secondhand clothing so easily. So there's obviously Poshmark, ThredUp, etc. Most recently came across this very cool one called Benny that allows you to like, it's just an API, like a Chrome plugin, that every time you're like browsing something or looking for something, it like will direct you to the secondhand version of that. So just like building in these like more sustainable habits. So yeah, since we're talking about digital transformation and digital solutions, I'm really excited about all of these platforms that that are coming up that are making those shifts in behavior much easier.
Yeah, so many great ideas. I see some of my team members are taking notes, so we're definitely going to look into all of those ideas or company you've been talked to. Since no one mentioned generative AI, I'm going to bring it up. So it has received a lot of buzz around this concept. Do you think it has a role in sustainability and decarbonization? Like what kind of use case could leverage generative AI? Yeah, I'd love to hear your take on this.
So we do a lot. There's a lot of manual work involved in trying to analyze the efficiency of a building today. And so to the extent that those models can start looking at load profile data and taking over the work of energy engineers, that's pretty tedious in certain cases. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So it's definitely something we're trying to play around with as a company. I wouldn't say we figured it out yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of opportunities on the consumer education side, on the communication side, on bringing people up to speed and into new products. I think if we think about like assets on the grid and the cybersecurity and privacy implications of that, or turning on, off, and on switch, just given some of the bias concerns in some of the generative models, I think there are limitations. So I think there's a really nice use case today that feels obvious on the B2C side, but maybe less so in some of like the deeper operational physical asset side.
Yeah, I think whether it's generative or predictive, AI definitely has a place in the circular economy. A couple of use cases that come to mind. One is we at Glacier have always been really keen on this idea of the smart MRF. And a MRF is a materials recovery facility or a recycling facility. But right now, imagine just a really old school industrial factory, and you have to basically go through and like fine tune the belt speeds and like what angle the discs are moving at, and basically there's dozens and dozens of inputs that impact whether you're actually extracting all the material successfully or not. There's no reason why it should rely on just an operator kind of like putting a finger up to the wind and being like, I think it needs to go a little bit faster today, right? A lot of it is just real guesswork, and they're processing, thousands, tens of thousands of tons a year in this fashion. So to the extent that we can start loading up more sensors, collecting more data, and then using that to predict, when the composition of material looks like X, then you need to rely on Y configuration. That kind of real-time feedback loop would be hugely valuable for actually improving the performance of all of these facilities and, frankly, the whole infrastructure more broadly. Then one of my pipe dreams on the generative front is we talk a lot at Glacier now with these consumer brands about basically how to design packaging in a way that is actually recyclable, right? There are a lot of tips that, frankly, recycling facilities aren't having those conversations with brands, and it's through no fault of anyone, just those connections are hard to make. But you can imagine a world where as you start to gather more data, like we're doing on what types of packaging actually are and are not getting recycled, you can start to extract features that make things more or more recyclable, either at the consumer level or at the recycling facility level. And maybe you can actually take that and start to generate new ideas for what packaging should look like, what the composition of that resin should be, or even the overall shape or form factor. So I think there are a lot of really interesting creative opportunities for generative AI as well.
Nice. So I did a very meta thing, and I actually asked this question to ChatGPT. And it's funny. I mean, the answer that it spat out was like pretty spot on. So generative AI has a lot of, there's a lot of value in it helping design buildings and designing just more efficient processes, whether that actually relates to, redesigning how a factory works, or whether that, comes down to how can you actually make the material itself, right? Like the solar PV cell or whatever it is, how can you actually make that more efficient, and just as you go about things like testing, etc., just like making those iterations a lot quicker. So those are some. I actually think specifically, the industry that at least I or some of us work in like the energy front, there's just so much manual work that goes into things like RFPs or grants, when you're trying to whether build hard tech or even work in software, etc. There's also just so much goes into like permitting or streamlining certain pieces of like trying to, I don't know if anyone's trying to get solar on their rooftop, right? There's a whole like interconnection process. Now they're trying to do a little bit more of that just to get like a level 2 home charger, even if you're in a place like Palo Alto. So there's tons of opportunity to help streamline those things, at least from like a more yeah, like regulatory perspective or just checking certain boxes. So I'm really excited about that, and yeah, all the things that ChatGPT said too.
Yeah, I've been finding myself using ChatGPT more nowadays. But I think permitting is a really good point. I've heard that from multiple people, like parties, it is a bottleneck for us deploying more renewables or getting more, as we get more load on the grid, permitting is becoming more and more of a bottleneck for the process. So if generative AI can help speed up that process, it could be yeah. But I've also heard like contrarian views on that, running those big models could consume a lot of power, which in turn translate into emissions, given that our grid is not fully clean yet. So it's definitely still at the early stage of its development. Good. I guess the last question I have is like, are there any areas that you wish to see more digital innovation coming in, but currently doesn't have solutions out there yet?
I mean, well, so one of the things that we're working on is trying to provide more of like an all-encompassing, how do I get to net zero kind of solution for our customers. And it's obviously easier said than done, but we're trying to do that in as digital a process as possible. What's interesting is there's lots of different folks trying to work in this space, but a lot of the companies are sort of viewed as almost like lead gen. So you can put your address into a variety of websites and get quotes for solar and stuff like that, but then you might also get a lot of spam. So we're trying to find sort of a pathway here that feels right for consumers and isn't just like pushing a bunch of junk at people, but really provides that, here is your path to net zero, here's the glide path kind of approach.
We are looking at so many things for digital. I think one thing about hardware investing is sometimes it's a maturation point. Like, again, I'll use utility scale solar, where the big problem for utility scale solar was just the cost of the hardware and the infrastructure. And once that hit a certain point, scale really was allowed to take off, and software could play a really important role kind of from that moment and into the future on digitization, optimization. But if soft cost is only a teeny tiny portion of your cost center, it's not really maybe the most appropriate thing to work on. So I think there are some industries where we're kind of tracking the maturation of the industry that are really early today, carbon capture, some forms of industrial heat, long duration storage, where these are just like innovating, right now, and maybe there isn't as much of a role for digitization like today. But I think there's also a lot of industries and worlds where the innovation on the hardware side and the software side are kind of happening at the same time. So I think something we're seeing a lot of right now is supply chain and kind of critical mineral and kind of going upstream of the energy and transportation industries, where a lot of mining techniques are changing, but they're also leveraging digital tools. I think Catherine just had a really nice article on lithium extraction. So those things are kind of evolving at the same time. And so I think we have our eyes on, what low carbon hydrogen looks like, and what lithium extraction looks like, and what supply chains generally look like, and how the digital can help support the continued evolution of the hardware.
Yeah, I'm going to keep talking about recycling because that's what I know best. So one is one of Glacier's core value propositions, right, which is literally just digitalizing the entire circular economy. Like, we have no sense of what's actually coming through our waste or recycling streams. There's no way to actually improve upon it unless you actually get that baseline. And so that's literally what we're building towards at Glacier every single day. So that's an obvious one. And then on a related note, one thing that I find interesting and also very alarming is in some regards, like the lack of controls that the basic recycling facility has. So I'll give you an example. Lithium-ion batteries or propane tanks. These are two of the biggest culprits that come through recycling facilities all the time. And literally when I call a customer and they text me back, can't talk, I'm in the middle of a fire, they literally mean a fire, right? So you'll talk to a facility, and I've talked to facilities that say they see anywhere between 2 and 5 facility fires a week from these types of items. It's crazy, right? And so right now, you can imagine if you're processing hundreds or thousands of tons of material a day, what's the likelihood you're going to catch that tiny lithium-ion battery that's buried under a pile of paper, right? It's extremely hazardous. This job is twice the injury rate of construction, and a lot of it is because of all these hazardous materials that consumers don't realize aren't actually recyclable and are, in fact, quite dangerous. And so in addition to what Glacier is working on, I think one need I hear over and over again from these facilities, and that I would love for the sake of their workers' livelihoods too, is to have some sort of signaling that can actually detect things like, hand grenades, which is a true story that I've heard from multiple recycling facilities, right? And act on it before it becomes a bigger problem. Yeah.
So not a follow-up on that one.
Yeah, that escalated. Yeah, I think the one area that I'm curious about that does have some extent of, obviously digital transformation that's already happened, but I think there's scope for a lot more as it relates to food waste. So I think right now, again, supermarkets, restaurants, etc., they have a relatively good sense of, what's going to waste, where, how. But I think that like second layer of really like, ensuring that it's optimized, even in terms of like what they're stocking, like just being smart about how they're placing orders, etc., and maybe like eventually automating all of that. I think there's like many ways to go there. So.
Well, thank you. We're going to turn the table to the audience to see if you guys have any question that you want to ask our panelists here.
Thank you, Yan, for the amazing panel, and thank you to our speakers. This was very helpful, and I think really, really insightful, actually. And the one, I think, Marie, you touched on this briefly in mentioning Charger Help, but I'm really curious around like workforce training and workforce upskilling, both in new and accelerating industries as well as industries that are facing like an aging out of the workforce, and how you see that relative to climate and sustainability.
Huge. I mean, I don't know an investor that's not thinking about that exact thing. It's just it's again like a really complex ecosystem. Are you going to just go to a trade school and say, hey, we have software that's going to solve your problems? Like, no. How do you thoughtfully kind of engage and build? Where does it make the most sense for more of like a training platform versus partnering with a trade school or something like that? Where does it make sense to help? I think we've seen a bunch of use cases for like corporations themselves or companies themselves to like build and license solutions in-house that they can customize. I think a few years ago we saw kind of the rise of the industrial worker, like using computer vision and VR to help train, especially around like out in the field worker safety. And I think some of that is going to come to bear on other industries. But a lot of people are worried about it. I don't think we have seen a ton of like super scalable, really high impact solutions yet. But I think we're also kind of at the cusp where like we see the problem, but it hasn't, in a lot of sectors, hasn't quite hit yet. Like home electrification is a really big one. So the example I'll give is a lot of people are being talked out of installing heat pumps by their HVAC installers, because an HVAC installer to just replace a gas furnace, it can be done in half a day. It's a super good margin. It's something they know. But with HVAC, you have to or with a heat pump, now you have to think about their gas line and maybe resizing their panel, and the equipment hasn't come in, and your distributor is not responding to your calls, and your margin's super low because you're new at it and you're trying to train somebody. It becomes this like really kind of confusing thing. And there's such an undersupply of HVAC, so they're not being forced to change because it's already a pretty good time to be an HVAC installer. So I think there's like a lot of industries where there's stories like that where it's starting to crack, but we haven't seen on the digital side something beyond like green work and a few others that are really trying to tackle the problem head on.
That's really helpful.
Thank you for a really good panel. I had a question on sustainability. We are bringing back manufacturing, we are bringing back fabs to the US for geopolitical reasons, but we still continue to ship out our waste products to countries far away and process them there at huge risks, personal risks to the people who are involved there. So it's interesting. I was watching a YouTube video from about 1930 or so in India, just watching the life there. It's now a big city and it's crazy pollution and traffic and everything. But 1930, everybody is wearing cotton saris. Everybody is carrying their goods in bamboo baskets. Speaking of decarbonization, it's all carbon, it's cellulose, but everything can be recycled. So I was wondering, from a national policy perspective, are we doing anything to get back recycling close to where we make the waste?
Yeah, I can tackle that one, I guess, now that I've established myself as the recycling person. It's a really good question, and as context for the audience, back in, I think it was 2018, one of the impetuses for starting Glacier was China, which was previously the world's largest importer of recyclables to be turned into new goods. They passed what's known as the National Sword Policy, which basically said, you all are sending us basically glorified trash. Like, we don't want to be in the business of incinerating or landfilling the world's trash. So until you quite literally clean up your act, so we're implementing very strict purity standards for recycling, we're no longer taking these imports, right? And this was part of actually what prompted a huge catalytic change for this whole industry, at least domestically, to say, oh, actually the name of the game is no longer crank through a bunch of tons and send them all to China. We actually have to be mindful of how we're treating this material and making sure that it's clean and useful. That was one, I think, overall positive change that came out of that. Secondly, what's also interesting is that you're seeing a lot of overseas manufacturers starting to set up shop domestically in the US now. So it's almost this like reverse process where they're establishing these manufacturing facilities or these reclamation facilities to get around those import bans, basically. And it has a good benefit from a carbon perspective, too, of saying, instead of putting this on a cargo ship and shipping it halfway around the world, we can actually drive it, 100 miles over to the reclamation plant, which is also great. And then finally, this isn't directly related to keeping things closer to home, but you are starting to see a lot of legislation come online in the past 2 or 3 years in a way that it never has before. One really hot topic is EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, which is already online in the EU, which I would say is like our older, more mature recycling sibling in a lot of ways, as well as in Canada. And the whole idea of it is, if you are a producer, let's say you're one of these big Fortune 100 brands, and you're putting, let's say, plastic packaging onto the market, you should be responsible for the cost of recycling and collecting that material. So we, as the government, are going to charge you based on how recyclable you can prove your packaging actually is, right? And so previously, it was kind of good enough to say, hey, this thing is hypothetically recyclable if you buy a super specialized piece of equipment and can strip it down into its parts, and so we can stamp a recycling logo on it. And now these producers are on the hook for hundreds of millions, maybe billions with a B, of dollars every single year, unless they can actually prove that their stuff is getting brought back into a healthy end market. So there is a lot of really great legislation coming online at the state level, even, and maybe one day federal, to support that.
Is that implemented in California right now?
Yeah, so there are currently already 4 states that have passed EPR legislation. Maybe unsurprisingly, California is one of them, and the others are Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. So that accounts for about a quarter to a third of recycling facilities across the country already. And there's about, I believe, a dozen additional states that are currently discussing it in their legislature.
Cool, super cool. Any other questions? Catherine?
All right, first, I would love to thank you all the Wonder Ladies here today. I think it's really inspiring to hear both all of you, your story, your view, perspective. And then I think I have 2 questions. So the first one is, think about sustainability and also digitalization. I think a big part is that the ownership of the data. For example, in between EVs and the grid, in between users and energy storage, in between second life of batteries, if we want to also reuse it. It's always come to I'm always saying, okay, who owns the data? Probably startups right now will own the data, but probably when we grow the business larger, will OEMs take over that? So I hope to hear from you what's your perspectives on when, who, and how your strategies on the ownership of data. And then second question, I think this is probably also helping the audience to ask, because right now I think we're at a very special time, look at the big macroeconomics, and with a unique, clean tech is probably a unique case within this big environment. What is your strategy, or the probably one sentence message that you want to deliver to everyone here, entrepreneurs, investors, how you get through this special time?
When it comes to your residential utility data, you own that. There's laws in California. Well, actually, I don't know if this is true across all of the U.S. See, this is the problem with this answer. I'm very California-centric historically, but I'm becoming more nationwide as we roll out programs all across the U.S. So in California in particular, I know that you own your own utility data. And so you have the rights to share it with whoever you want, basically. You still have to authorize third parties to get access to it. And there's sort of an annoying procedural thing that comes with that, but it's your data on your electric meters. Yeah, that's the short answer on that one. Maybe longer answer on the OEM data. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I guess as it pertains to your trash, like it's kind of funny because no one, I think in the history of ever until recently has ever asked like who owns the data of what you're throwing away, right? And so our perspective is there is no real data ownership in that sense yet, at least. And so, you know, we encourage all of our customers, whether they be brands or governments or recyclers, to go forth with that data and use it as they see fit, right? We're not really putting restrictions on any of them to use it in a certain way. I think for Glacier, one of the really interesting things in our end state is we want to become that source of truth that can really aggregate data across the entire country or even the world and help these bigger entities make decisions off of that aggregated data set, right? And the thing is that aggregated data set is something that if you are a single recycling facility, like maybe you have a portion of that, but that it doesn't really yield value until you can actually kind of mesh it all together. And so we actually see our value in, you know, not necessarily like being the owner of the data, but in interpreting that data and helping to inform what you should be doing as a result of that.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, similar to what Kate said, exactly where we sit is very much in like the utility side of the world. So utilities own all of that data. There's still a ton of, you know, like SOC 2 compliance and various other regulations, just given how sensitive a lot of grid information is, right? Like it's basically like a lot of federal stuff that you need to also stay compliant with. So I think it'll like continue to evolve, especially as we as we go through like various stages of who we're working with on the OEM side, or whether again like from state to state, utility to utility, muni to co-op, like those are all just such different flavors. But it's a learning journey. We're a startup where we're also figuring it out. So maybe I'll have a different answer for you in 5 years. But for now, that's how we're going about it.
I guess you had a second question around general messages or advice. Okay, I'll start with this one. I think as it pertains to the circular economy, like there are so many interesting players doing interesting things in the space. I do think though that one thing I've noticed is interestingly missing is startups who are really trying to think across the entire ecosystem, right? Like it wasn't, when I started in recycling, it probably wasn't until like month 2 or 3 that I actually finally understood what the circular economy actually means. And the circular economy involves, surprise, surprise, not just recyclers, but literally everything from making something through consuming it, through disposing of it, and like ideally bringing it back into circulation. And so I think my advice would be like, certainly there's value in looking at solutions that get really, really good at optimizing one part of that process. But I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit is actually just in connecting the dots across all of the players in this ecosystem, because right now, a lot of those conversations, it was a surprise to me, they're not actually happening, right? So for me, that's where a lot of the leverage actually lies today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we work with an industry, utilities that are essentially recession-proof, right? And so I'm sorry, I'm going to go ahead and say the R word, but you're never going to stop buying electricity from your utility, even in tough economic times. And so I think, you know, whether it's investors, job seekers, whoever it is that's thinking about this particular climate, I think that's just like a stakeholder that if you're thinking about companies that work with that stakeholder, I think for the most part, they're going to be pretty okay for the next few years. So I don't know if that's advice or a hot take, but yeah, that's like the few lines on how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think we basically were like, climate tech, we're fine. I think through 2022, like our companies were doing fine, up rounds, great progress, revenue. I think 2023, something has shifted, and a lot of the investment community, I don't need to tell you all, a lot has changed. The bar is higher. That's a lot of the language we're using. What's been really interesting is I don't think we have heard of any kind of massive blow to our companies in terms of, hey, we're selling to corporates with net zero commitments and they're pulling way back. They've cut their budget and they've slashed their sustainability staff. Like we're not hearing that. And so I think that's what is really an interesting part of this, is so much of it is voluntary. Now the IRA helps, and there's some federal stuff coming in, and I think that does provide a lot of tailwinds, but a lot of this was already kind of self-selected. For corporates, we want to do good, we see money, we see opportunity, and we haven't seen a ton of customer pullback yet. And so, you know, I think that's a promising thing, and I think if anything, like the really unsexy stuff of, hey, not only can you be good at climate, you can save yourself a lot of money, I think that resonates a little bit more maybe in the downtimes than it used to. But yeah, to date, I mean, the lesson from our portfolio so far is we just haven't seen it materially affect their like sales or commercial agreements.
Yeah, and then I guess I'll give sort of one positive indicator and then maybe one negative indicator. So I think when we saw the announcement from the SEC that everyone was going to have to report on their carbon emissions, we were super excited about that, and that was a really positive thing for our company. So I think big picture, long term, things are going in the right direction. What we have seen is that the owner-tenant problem is still definitely there. And especially in cases where there's uncertainty around like what real estate holdings people want to maintain, et cetera, then in those cases, people definitely don't want to invest in those buildings. So then they just keep owning and operating these like really inefficient buildings. So that's one of the problems that we've seen. And in certain cases, even with REITs, it's interesting, like also on positive upswing, we've had some REITs that will bring us in hand to their tenant. So there are some positive movements there, but where there is a lot of uncertainty around real estate holdings, I think that's probably one of the things that kind of scares us a little bit.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? If not, I want to thank our amazing panel. There's so many great insight from this conversation. I wish I can take notes, but I know my team member got that covered. So please feel free to go enjoy some food and drink, and hope you get a chance to mingle a bit and network with each other. Thank you again for everyone to come out tonight and support our event. Thank you, and have a good evening.